Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to our flipped classroom and our discussion of the French philosophe and the Enlightenment, right? So we're going to pick right where we left off in class, talking about the French philosophers, and we left off talking about Baron de Montesquieu, right? We talked a lot of stuff in class today about why all this is going down in France right now, about Hobbes and Locke and the ideas of the social contract that are popping up, and we discussed heavily as well what the Enlightenment is, right? We talked about what is it, and Sophie Pansavecchia explained it really well. It is the questioning of your government rather than your religion. Now, a big thing to understand, though, is that a big element of questioning is going to question that of the former religious zealotry and things like that. And we'll get into that mostly when we talk about our next guy, Voltaire. But let's pick up where we left off talking about none other than Baron de Montesquieu, or as what one of my former students said, Baron de Montesquieu. All right, so now, the big thing we left off on is The Spirit of Laws. Published anonymously is a book that advocated for the separation of powers to try and avoid the rise and growth of an absolutist, right? Now, an interesting facet about this is that it's basically saying that a multi-branch government with checks and balances over one another needs to be established to prevent any one group of men from becoming too powerful in a country, because once they become too powerful, they will then infringe upon the rights of the humans that they rule over, right? And so with Baron de Montesquieu's ideas, this was going to be added to the index of banned books along with De Rev, right? It was also heavily criticized in France because when this came out in 1748, you've got an absolutist pretty much on the throne in Louis XV, right? Because Louis XIV was already dead. It's going to be criticized heavily in France because the only thing that French people knew was, of course, an absolutist. But the Brits, on the other hand, loved it. The British loved it because they've been using a multi-branch system and a separated power government for hundreds of years, ever since the Magna Carta established that idea of a multi-branch house government, a bicameral organization known as the Parlement, right? Not the Parlement, but the Parlement, right? So Baron de Montesquieu, that separation of powers, very, very big thing that you need to know about him. And then we have our guy, our rock star, our dude that is the man of all men. Sometimes the Enlightenment is literally called the age of this man. He is so famous, in fact, that you have heard quotes by him. He's made mad money. This man rigged the lottery at one point and actually made a ridiculous amount of money because he was so smart. He got arrested multiple times and was locked up in the Bastille in 1717 when he was a young man. He wrote all kinds of novels and books and stories about religion and the ideas of government and the ideas of individual rights, and his ideas on religion as well. And he is so famous that everyone knows his name when you talk about like the Enlightenment, right? And his name is Francois Marie Arouet. And some of you are like, that doesn't sound familiar. Well, it's because you know him by his pen name, Voltaire, right? So like now, Voltaire, the famous Enlightenment thinker that sometimes people refer to the Enlightenment as the Age of Voltaire. Voltaire, the man that one of my places I have to go is to see his gravesite in Paris, right? Like it's inside this giant building called the Pantheon and stuff like that. People used to flock to Voltaire to ask him for his ideas, ask for him for the consideration of criticizing or looking over a governmental perspective, asking him, sir, is there any difference between good and evil? Like literally, Voltaire is the Enlightenment superhero. He is the rock star of the Enlightenment. He is the man, right? So you need to understand big things about Voltaire is that getting after it, he is going to be a very, very big Enlightenment thinker, right? And his main ideas are going to focus around deism and religious tolerance, right? His main focus is going to be that of the ideas of tolerating everyone's religion, right? So his early career when he was a young man, he began writing a very long poem about Henry IV, right? And he wrote a very long poem about Henry IV, Henry the Great, a.k.a. Henry the Great, chicken in every pot guy, Louis XIII's dad, Louis XIV's grandfather. So when we're looking at this entire thing, though, he wrote a very long poem, and he noticed when he was doing his research and all of his different things on the French wars of religion, he was like, men have died over religion that they don't even really understand. Men have been so dumb as to be convinced by clergy to go out and sacrifice their lives and fight for something that they truly believe that they are being rewarded for in an afterlife, while like one believes they are good and the other believes they are evil, and then each side vice versa, right? And another big thing that he also advocates for is the idea of a different look upon God, right? He actually said he believed that he was like a deist at the time, and deists believed that God like made the world and then just kind of like took a step back and is just watching everything happen. Not that he is actively involved in people's lives, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves right now. The number one thing you need to understand about Voltaire and all of his writings is he hates the idea of fanaticism, right? Fanaticism as in being a fanatic, being superstitious, or believing in any idea so unrequitedly and so heavy belief forward that it causes blinders to show up and for you to be able to actually not understand logic and reason anymore. So he heavily lashed out against the churches and heavily lashed out against the religious warfare that had destroyed the continent for hundreds of years, right? Look at when he was born. He was born in 1694. He's born about 50 years after the 30 Years' War had already ended. And he's noticing certain governments in certain countries are growing rapidly because they religiously tolerate people, and certain are not, and they're plateauing because they're still not religiously tolerant. Now, a big thing you have to understand about this is a lot of his ideas. He's going to feud with a bunch of people. He's going to write this very, very long poem about how it was wrongdoing in the French Wars of Religion, and it's going to bring him under a lot of flack. And he actually has to be exiled at one point. He has to run away out of France to avoid being put in prison again, because he was literally locked up in jail when he was in his 20s, you know what I mean, for like actually lashing out against a noble and stuff like that. And so when he was exiled out in England, he saw a beautiful sight, and he fell in love with the ideas of English culture. A lot like Baron de Montesquieu's ideas of separation of powers, Voltaire loved the English, right? And he has a very famous scene in one of the books that he actually wrote on the English, right? And he actually literally it's called On the English, and the Royal Exchange is the symbol that he used. And what the Royal Exchange is it's this massive stock exchange inside of like Great Britain. And he said in the stock exchange and the Royal Exchange in Great Britain, every religion comes together, and they do not hate one another, besmirch one another, or fight one another based on religious ideas that they may or may not even fully understand. They are there worshiping one thing: money and the advancement of their economy. And the only infidels are the bankrupts, right? And so the big thing about it, though, is in general, he's saying that the progression of people is better if you religiously tolerate everyone. And that everyone's idea about God is probably a little bit off anyway. And that if a deity really exists, he's probably just in the background. He later on came back to France after publishing his ideas on the English, and he's going to receive heavy criticism. It's going to be massively censored, and an arrest warrant's going to come out on him, right? And Voltaire, to escape being arrested yet again, is going to be saved by a very prominent family, the Châtelet family that lives in a place called Lorraine, France, right? And it was mainly saved due to the fact that he might have been having an affair with the Châtelet nobleman's wife, right? Known as the Madame Châtelet, Émile du Châtelet, right? And so the big thing was that she actually went up to her husband and up to the French government and said, please do not lock this man up. Do not put him in prison. He is a great mind. Instead, we will put him under house arrest in our home, and he will help me actually understand the ideas of science and philosophy and things like that. And so under the Châtelet family, he actually wrote many of his most famous works, including one known as Candide, but we'll talk about here in a second. The thing about it, though, also is he wrote many works on the ideas of a noble Machiavellian monarch, the idea of an absolutist that has a lot of benevolence for their people. And here's the weirdest part about it too. For being a guy that loves religious tolerance, he actually liked Louis XIV. Weird, right? He mainly just liked the idea of a benevolent monarch that's not directly disenfranchising the people. But also remember, he's living in the country that doesn't have as much censorship when it actually comes to direct ideas from the monarch themselves, right? A lot of it has more to do with nobles and them being upset about things that they really shouldn't even be involved in, right? So he believed in the idea of a noble non-Machiavellian monarch that's not mean or crass or whatever. He also believed that human beings are naturally unequal, right? For somebody that believes in religious tolerance, he believed that not all men are created equal. He said that there are feeble and strong, the intelligent, the dim, the rich, the poor, and that it is the job of the strong, the rich, the intelligent, the wealthy to protect the rights of the people that are feeble underneath them, right? So that's really important as well. He also wrote a very famous book called Candide that you'll probably end up reading in a philosophy class one day, which kind of mocks the idea of optimism, saying that evil doesn't exist and all this other stuff. He basically says that there are truly gross and disgusting things that happen around us every day, and we need to cultivate our garden, and we need to understand that we have to avoid those things at all possible costs, right? And save as many people as we can. He also apparently famously said this one famous quote: I may disapprove of the things that you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Now, ironically enough, he probably didn't say that. An English woman who wrote about him said that he said it, but he didn't actually say it, right? So the other big famous Enlightenment thinker as well coming up, who's not as big as Voltaire, but is still really important, is a guy named Denis Diderot, right? Denis Diderot is very famous for writing one particular book, the Encyclopedia, right? He writes the Encyclopedia in 1751. He wanted to collect all the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu and Hobbes and Locke and collect them all into one giant book that people could have access to and actually go out and read, right? Well, the thing about it is his book will also be banned, all right? So, fun fact, because people don't like the idea that people can go out and just read whatever they want. Oh, yeah, what a terrible idea, right? So, also, another big thing you need to understand is Enlightenment culture is going to continue to spread. And it's going to leave France a little bit and become focused in another country. France and Scotland, ironically enough, right? So Scotland is going to have several Enlightenment thinkers as well. Two of the most famous ones, because intellectual systems are going to grow very rapidly in Scotland because they actually create the very first public education system. And the two most important figures of the Scottish Enlightenment are Adam Smith and David Hume, right? Now we'll start off with Adam Smith first. Adam Smith is a very, 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 very famous Enlightenment thinker because he is the father of modern day economics, right? He looked at mercantilism and was like, yo, this is dumb, right? And basically Adam Smith created a system where money is exchanged for goods and services and that naturally competition should run a free market society, right? And so basically Adam Smith gave birth to the concept of capitalism before it even had a name, right? He advocated for laissez-faire markets. Laissez-faire means no government intervention in the markets, right? The government should not be trying to hoard wealth for itself. It should be trying to worry about taxing people only to provide roads, provide security, and provide basic things, right? So the ideas that he actually created in his book that he wrote called Wealth of Nations, write that down, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith will advocate the ideas of capitalism and the ideas behind non-laissez-faire economics. Mind your own business, government, and stop dipping your hand in my pocket and actually worry about providing basic securities for people and nothing else, right? He also believed in the invisible hand of competition, which I'll explain at the review tomorrow morning, right? It's kind of just the basic idea that competition drives societies forward and makes economics better, right? So we're now looking at Enlightenment thinkers that are branching out of just these different ideas. Now, David Hume is the father of religious skepticism, right, and empirical learning. Another big guy that advocated for religious tolerance, and he also believes that we need to avoid, that there are impressions upon us and that we need to grapple with our feelings, right? He basically said that no one knows anything beyond a shadow of a doubt, and the only real thing that we know is that reason plays a part in our feelings. He was like, oh no, you feel some type of way about something, and you're going to argue for it, and you try to make reason back it up, right? And another big thing as well is he argued for empirical learning, that we learn by seeing and doing, not actually by reasoning or reading or doing anything from afar, right? And so a big thing about David Hume is he's your last Scottish Enlightenment thinker. He will not be on the test, but he's still important to know going forward when we get into these flips over break, okay? But I'll talk to y'all soon. Y'all have a great one. See y'all tomorrow.